Aleksandr Voronovici, thank you for accepting talking about your project and your academic experience here at Durham College. Could you tell us in the beginning what is your academic background?
Thank you for inviting me. I just defended my PhD a year ago at Central European University, PhD in Comparative History. And before that I did my MA as well at Central European University in Budapest. Before that I did my 4-year BA in Anthropology in Moldova. And mostly my interests lie in the 21st century history of Central and Eastern Europe. Primarily Soviet history and Soviet Ukrainian, Soviet Moldovan cases are the main cases for me. In general, I have different interests, mostly dealing with political history, but also recent political events as well, and political developments as well. And during my PhD studies, I have been to various places and various scholarships and so on. I was in Manchester, in Toronto, in Moscow, and so on, and a couple of other places, and that helped me to prepare for my future academic career.
Mm-hmm. Your project here at NEC as a Pontica Magna Fellow was in relation with your PhD, which deals with borderland policies between 1922 and 1934.
Yeah.
In the Soviet Union, mainly Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yeah.
What is the objective of the project?
Well, yes, my project, which I was doing here, is the extension of my PhD project, of my PhD dissertation. I'm trying now to extend it a bit chronologically, preparing a book manuscript, which I hope to publish in the nearby future in an English academic publishing house. And the goal of the project is primarily to look at the struggle of borderlands in the 1920s and first half of 1930s, over these contested territories on Soviet western border, but also in the neighboring countries as well. We could take Polish, Romanian, and Czechoslovak, for instance, eastern territories that were contested by the Soviet Union, and to see the evolution of this struggle over borderland for these contested territories, and how it influenced the development of the Soviet political project and Soviet imperial project and Soviet nationality policies. And to this end, I very much look into various negotiations and discussions which were taking place among Soviet leaders and Soviet activists on both sides of the borders. And partially because I think within these discussions, these Soviet activists were formulating what does, for instance, Ukrainian, Moldovan, Romanian, or Russian mean within the Soviet context, within the Soviet framework. And I think actually that some of these discussions and some of the decisions which were made during this period, after the revolution and in the first 10-15 years after the revolution, they had significant consequences for these territories throughout the 20th century, I would say.
Why this temporal break, 22-34, and what is a borderland policy?
Mm-hmm. Actually, now I'm trying to extend more towards the revolution. So 22 originally was the plan, because this is the moment when the Soviet Union as a political entity was created. When all these various agreements between Soviet republics were somehow structuralized into more or less coherent agreement between all the Soviet republics. Now I'm also looking more closely into the 1917-1922 period as well, because I think a lot of important things happened there for my project and in general for these territories. 1934, the idea was get this moment between, let's say, the end of the famine in the Ukraine, more or less, but not going too much into the 36-37 with the Great Terror, because this is an additional big story which was going there. So get this moment when it's more or less calming down a bit the situation in these territories and get the feeling where it's going without extending the research too much and overstretching it. And also the other issue here is that roughly in the mid-1930s there are significant changes, partially as a result of what was happening with the famine and in Ukraine, but there are significant changes in Soviet nationality policies, like some reformulation of some of the important elements of it. By Soviet borderland policies, I mean policies which are directed and at this contested character of territories on both sides of the border, which are guided by this struggle of borderlands, and which are very much related to this and focused on the cross-border cultural ties. And so almost, and mostly of course I focus here on nationality policies because this is one of the key elements, but also of course foreign policy is coming into play, and this is exactly basically the interplay of this nationality and foreign policies which are at the center of my attention. And this idea how we can use the fact that, for instance, Ukrainians are living on both sides of the border, or like Moldovans are living on both sides of the border, how we can use it to our advantage, or on the contrary, how it can be dangerous for us that there are Ukrainians on both sides of the border and these ties can be, for instance, suspicious for us. That's what we're seeing. Actually, we see it from the beginning, but it is becoming more and more a stronger emphasis towards the 1930s and later on.
What do you bring to the analysis of the relationship between the political center and various republics in the Soviet Union in this period? What is happening and what your project dealing with borderlands brings into the picture that was not necessarily present in the history of the field?
One important thing is the fact that we can see the agenda of local and Republican Soviet leaders and Soviet activists, which is not limited by Soviet borders, because very often it's kind of perceived that foreign policy, for instance, or all the foreign issues are very much the prerogative of the center of Moscow, because it was so important that they did not want to allow all others to participate in that and to create some kind of chaos in that sense. But what actually I see in the documents which I work on and which I analyze is that there was a significant space for the activities of various local and Republican actors. And it was not necessarily always prohibited by the center right away. So the center was quite open to see some sort of where it goes, let's say, and probably to experiment a bit, until of course they felt that it's too endangering the security of the Soviet Union or some key Soviet policies in social and economical transformation. So I would say this is one important element which I'm bringing in my research. The other important thing is that I'm trying to look exactly at various positions and to see the alternatives in these discussions, in these debates, to see what alternatives were suggested and to understand to what extent what could have been the factors which somehow favored the choice of one alternative to the other. Very often the story of Soviet nationality policies is either very much top-down or very much like the discussion between Moscow and some local center without seeing how many actors were involved in this discussion. And I think when see it within this framework, we somehow lose the sight of alternatives and get some sort of teleological narrative very often in the end. And this is what I'm trying to escape and to understand actually what were the balances of power within these republics and on the other side of the border of activists, so especially pro-Soviet and pro-communist activists on the other side of the border. Partially because this is also the picture which Moscow was seeing. So they were getting different signals, different reactions from these territories. And they were making decisions not based only on discussion with the capital, for instance, of Ukraine, of Kharkiv, but they could see that there was different positions in Kharkiv, for instance. and if we go beyond Kharkiv, there will be even more our positions. In that sense, it allows to see, well, primarily what the possibilities, what is the space of possibilities. So not all the choices were predetermined, but rather they were taken, and this is exactly one of the important goals of my project, is to see which alternatives were not taken. So let's say, and to understand why these alternatives were not taken for various reasons. And this is all very often very situational and circumstantial, like why this or this alternative was preferred, but that kind of also gave the understanding of the reaction of local elites, Soviet elites, and how they understood nationality policies or borderland policies, how they understood what is Soviet Ukrainian and what does Soviet Ukrainian means in international terms, if we look beyond borders of the Soviet Union. And I think this is an important issue.
What about your material? Probably you worked in numerous archives. Could you tell us about this?
Material is coming really from various places. It's both published and unpublished materials. Of course, primarily my materials are coming from Ukraine, because this is my main case study, but of course also Russian, Moldova, and Polish and Romanian materials, and partially also Czechoslovak materials. And also, of course, I dig into the various important communist international organizations like Comintern, which kind of encompasses and is a framework where some of these debates were taking place. And mostly, of course, these are party documents and documents of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Moldovan section of the Communist Party of Ukraine, and also to some extent the Romanian Communist Party, Czechoslovak Communist Party, and Polish Communist Party documents. So I'm trying to somehow put this mosaic and puzzle together and to see these different agendas and different positions which were expressed in various issues, and also very often the conflicts between these different agendas and different positions, because this is where some of the most important issues were expressed in the conflicts and in the debates, in the misunderstandings and overlapping agendas and so on.
So probably most of the material is in Russian, but you have also in Romanian, Polish, and...
Yeah, most of the materials are Russian, Ukrainian, but there are materials, of course, in Romanian, Moldovan, specific Moldovan of the 1920s, and Polish, of course, and all Comintern materials are sometimes in German and French. That's kind of, I think, most of the stuff. Well, there are a couple of things in English as well, but they're less so, more, I would say more in German at that moment.
You've been here for already a number of months in this multidisciplinary environment. What was your experience here at Durham College, being with other fellows from different disciplines?
Well, I found it very exciting. It's like it's a very comfortable atmosphere, a very comfortable and pleasant working atmosphere, very welcoming, and welcoming both from the side of like permanent members of the Durham College and also the incoming fellows like me who are here on temporary basis. And I found also this very diverse research interest of fellows, very interesting and exciting and challenging for myself. All the seminars were very interesting for me because on some issues I had almost zero knowledge, but in that sense it was also exactly why it was so pleasant to see what our people are doing and to try to understand what our people are doing, and maybe sometimes even surprisingly find some commonalities between your subject, which feels like to be very far away from the subjects and from the research interests of other fellows, but at the same time you still find a lot of commonalities. The other issue is it's a very pleasant group of people, so I think we've made great friends. Having some sort of common agenda being academics, but at the same time having different interests, but still kind of merged together pretty well and created a very nice and comfortable atmosphere, both while working and in the informal setting as well.
You are part of a Pontica Magna program already for a number of years here at NEC. What aiming at bringing people around the Black Sea together, various fellows? What is the experience of such programs and the relevance for nowadays region?
I think it has several key and very important dimensions to me. First of all, in general, you don't necessarily always bring people from the Black Sea region together. So somehow people are usually more divided, like Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, Caucasus, and somehow you don't necessarily always end up in this group of people, in this selection of people coming from these countries in one place and experiencing this multidisciplinary and very diverse academic environment and very diverse research interests and so on. Secondly, in my experience, NEC was one of the best settings for people from this area to get somehow into the international environment, let's say, and feeling comfortable integrating into this international academic environment without necessarily also going too far away from their own places and from their own home countries and from their home. So still staying within the region, more or less, but still getting exposed to this international academia and enjoying time and both research and informal time with people from different countries. And another, of course, element here is just simply the possibility to meet people from different countries, because this is from this region, because sometimes we somehow, even though we're very close geographically, we somehow not necessarily often end up, especially for a prolonged period, next to each other, when we can not just present something at the conference and for 10 minutes and maybe have a coffee afterward, but more or less have time to discuss various things, to find out more about the countries which are very close, but sometimes we don't necessarily know much about because we didn't have the opportunity to get this information, to meet people from there, and in that sense it's also, I think, a very, very comfortable and very productive framework and very productive exposure to other people from the countries which are close but far sometimes.
Was it your first time in Bucharest?
Well, basically, yes. I was here, I think, 2 years ago for 3 days, but that's kind of does not necessarily count.
For people, future applicants to NEC fellowships, what would you say about the city and about the position of NEC?
Well, I would say, personally, I didn't have enough of it. So even though I was here, let's say 4 months, more or less, and 1 month I was abroad on research, I still feel that there is quite a lot of still to explore in Bucharest. It's very interesting and surprising and city, and somehow maybe is not necessarily, let's say, a beautiful city in the classical sense of Vienna, for instance, St. Petersburg, or maybe Budapest, or so on, but it has certain atmosphere, certain vibe, specific vibe, which is very exciting, let's say, and very interesting to somehow to decipher and to feel. I've had great pleasure of getting a bit of this feeling. In that sense, also, I very much liked where the NEC is situated, because this district of Bucharest is, I think, one of the most fascinating districts. In Bucharest, very close to the center, but at the same time not not the tourist center, let's say, and with a lot of very nice villas just around in the neighborhood, and in that sense, I felt very comfortable here and very interesting actually going around. Just going from the place you live to NEC is already quite an exciting tour, I would say. And you can see different layers of Bucharest already just on this short walks of 15-20 minutes. You can already see different layers of Bucharest and see how interesting and how exciting the city is, and how different it can be as well, and different faces of the city.
What are your next plans?
My next plans are, of course, to continue the academic academic career, which presupposes, of course, various projects, and again, hopefully many fellowships. We'll see how it will work out. For now, my main goal is to get into one of the projects which I'm part of, memory politics in post-89, post-91 Eastern Europe, and for that I will probably need to travel a bit around Russia and Ukraine to gather some material. Long term, of course, is getting a position at the university would be probably my main goal, let's say, because I quite love teaching, as I've noticed from my previous experience. So I feel very comfortable not only researching but also doing the teaching part of the academic life.
Aleksandr, good luck with all of this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.